Greetings, friends. Welcome back to our series on the Seven Trumpets. And we're just going to be continuing our deliberations on the introductory concepts surrounding the trumpets. And it's very important that we spend a lot of time on this because this is the important background through which we're going to properly understand the trumpets. Now, one of the last things we looked at was the whole concept of the week of time, and this is so critical to our understanding of the trumpet. What we need to understand and to remember is that this is all about the great controversy, the warfare between good and evil, between Christ and Satan, that is about the character of God, really. This whole controversy is unraveling to reveal what God's character really is and to make known to the world the false claims that the devil brought up about the character of God. So the whole plan of salvation is summarized in this week of time. And we said before that God has denoted 6 days in which to allow the sin problem to unravel itself and to allow human beings to actually accept this plan or reject this plan. And then after that 6,000 year period, or that 6 days or 6 God days in the eyes of God, He's going to put an end to everything uh, by sending His Son to actually deliver saints. And that is going to start a period called the millennium, during which the judgment of the wicked and the final vindication of the character of God is actually going to occur. So we call this the day of the Lord. So we said that there's a 7,000 year period of time that is taken out of eternity, during which sin is going to be dealt with and sin is going to be put down forever. At the end of that 7,000 years, eternity will resume, and we would have had now a new heaven and a new earth for a recreated man. So a recreated world for a recreated man. And the plan of salvation would have been totally effective. So this whole, every time we talk about the trumpets, we must remember the plan of salvation and the week of time. The week of time is denoted by God to actually deal with the sin problem, to actually implement this plan of salvation, and to restore mankind to what he was before he fell. All right, and we also said that the first six trumpets are directly linked to the 6,000 years of controversy, and the seventh trumpet is directly linked to that seventh day, that seventh God day, that 1,000 year period, the final 1,000 year period, or the millennium, during which the earth is gonna rest from the works of sin, and the judgment of the wicked, the investigative judgment of the wicked, where the saints actually go through the records of the wicked and actually confirm, yes, our God is just in everything He did, in all the pronouncements He made on the sinners, on Satan, and all the angels, the evil angels, the judgment, the reward that they're going to be getting at the end of the 1,000 years is just. So all of this period is denoted to unravel the devices of the enemy. The whole plan of salvation is to unravel the devices of the enemy and to deliver mankind from the clutches of Satan and restore mankind to where he was before sin came. So that's what we need to bear in mind. The topic of, okay? So the plan of salvation is directly linked to the week of time and is directly linked also to the sanctuary service, because the plan of salvation was going to be effected through what was called the sanctuary ministry. Now, the sanctuary ministry was the medium through which God would remove sin from his people. Sin is what separates mankind from God, and therefore God placed the sanctuary service in the midst of Israel, ancient Israel, so that he would be able to remove sin from them and therefore dwell among them, because sin is what separates us from God. So the plan of salvation is effected during this week of time, the 7,000 year period, and during this time, the sanctuary service was given as a type of what Christ would have come to do in the heavenly sanctuary. in both his earthly ministry and also his heavenly ministry in the sanctuary. And during all of this time, the great controversy, warfare between Christ and Satan would have been ongoing. So we need to bear all of these things in mind. Now, the first thing is that the first illustration of this whole plan of salvation and how Christ would have come to actually uh, carry out or effect all of these different stages. All of that was given in an example, and that example was found in the Old Testament, and it was given in 7 ancient Jewish feasts. Now, all of these feasts were actually steps in the whole chain of events that Christ would have himself fulfilled and carried out to effect what we call the plan of salvation. So the plan of salvation, or the work of Jesus Christ on man's behalf to remove sin from us, would have been revealed in all these 7 Jewish feasts. So Christ would come to fulfill every single one of these Jewish feasts. So God gave the Jewish feasts in the Old Testament times so that his people would have an understanding and an appreciation of what he, Jesus Christ, would come later on to do physically or literally. So in the Old Testament, the illustration of the plan of salvation occurred during these 7 Jewish feasts of the sanctuary system. So the sanctuary system and the Jewish feasts were used to illustrate the plan of salvation, or in other words, the work that Christ would come to do on man's behalf. Now, in the New Testament, the whole great controversy, warfare, and also the plan of salvation is also demonstrated and illustrated in Revelation 7 Trumpets. And as a matter of fact, Revelation 7 Trumpets are actually built upon the Old Testament foundation of 7 Jewish feasts. So, if we want to understand Revelation 7 Trumpets properly, we have to understand the 7 ancient feasts, because the 7 trumpets are actually built upon the foundation of the 7 Jewish feasts. So if the 7 Jewish feasts were there to illustrate what Christ would come to do in fulfilling all of these different segments in the plan of salvation, it also means that the 7 trumpets also show what Christ would be coming to do to actually work out man's salvation as well. So they're all linked. The 7 trumpets therefore portray the great warfare between good and evil as portrayed through world events. So the 7 trumpets actually show the warfare, the interplay between good and evil that's taking place between God and his people and Satan and his people. And it portrays this warfare through the events of secular world history. And during this time, uh, especially during the first 6 trumpets we established the last lecture, that is the time during which Christ is ministering. So while Christ is ministering, while he's working out his plan of salvation, the devil is also counter-working with the great controversy, warfare that he is waging against God and his government. So it's like one is carrying out the mission of salvation, one is trying to carry out the mission of destruction. And the 7 trumpets actually show this warfare, this play and counterplay. So the trumpets numbers 1 to 6 actually illustrate, when you look on these trumpets uh, in a very specific way, you actually will actually realize when you actually look at them that trumpets number 1 to 6 actually portray the wrath or the actions of the devil against God and against his saints and against the work of God, counter the plan of salvation, and to counter the work that Christ is doing in the sanctuary on man's behalf. Trumpet number 7 is outlining the wrath of God. So trumpets 1 to 6, the wrath of Satan against God and his people. In trumpet number 7, God now stands up. He now reveals himself in his wrath. And he now comes to put an end to the great controversy, comes to complete his plan of salvation, comes to put an end to the destruction of the devil, and to vindicate his character and to deliver his saints. So trumpet number 7, also called the day of the Lord, is a 1,000-year period, which we're going to look at in more detail. It's that period, during that period, at the start of that period, that the Lord delivers his saints, takes them to heaven, and begins the work of investigative judgment of the wicked. And finally, at the end of that 1,000-year period, actually results in the full destruction of the wicked, the putting an end to sin, and the final vindication of the character of God before the entire universe, and the closing of the great controversy against between Christ and Satan about the character of God. So all of these things are very much interlinked. Now, we looked on the fact that we can see that the seven trumpets are embedded or directly linked to Christ's ministry because of how the trumpets flow. And we looked at this the last time. We said that it should have actually flown from chapter verse 2, verse 6 of Revelation chapter 8. So you would have been shown the seven angels standing before God and them giving seven trumpets, and then it would have naturally gone to the fact that seven angels were now ready to sound. But interjected between those two verses were a set of verses which outlined a process of ministration. And we said that this actually shows that the seven trumpets actually run concurrently with the ministration of Christ. That is what this is actually showing. And we know that the ministration of Christ began in AD 31, and that would concur with the angel with the censer and the incense coming before God and offering the prayers of the saints up before God. This is basically a symbolism of Christ's perfect ministry in the heavenly sanctuary on our behalf, which began in AD 31. And that exactly is the time when the first trumpet began. The first trumpet has to do with the start or began at the period when Christ's work in heaven interceding for us started. And what we notice that the time actually came when the angel, or in this case, symbolism of Christ, cast the censer down, indicating that his ministration was now ended. And once Christ's ministration on behalf of sinners ends, there is no more time for what? For mercy. Mercy is now done, and judgment is now come. So that is why we see here voices, thunderings, lightnings, and an earthquake. And we see an exact type of this or example of this in Ezekiel chapter 10 and verse 2, where the same man in linen, now remember, this angel is actually a representation of Christ. Now in Ezekiel chapter 10 verse 2, Jesus is also represented now as a man in linen, and he's told to go in between the two cherubs to get some coals from under the altar, and he's to take those coals of fire and he's to cast them over the city of Jerusalem, which was indicating that God's impending judgment and wrath was about to be visited upon the city of Jerusalem. So we see here Jerusalem here was a type of what is going to happen at the end of time to the world. The world that is rebellious and disobedient to God is finally going to meet the judgment and the wrath of God. And that occurs when the seventh trumpet begins. So the seventh trumpet is the trumpet which demarks the beginning of the day of the Lord, or the beginning of the wrath of God. So that shows us clearly that trumpet number 6 would have ended at the close of probation, and trumpet number 7 would have begun at the close of probation. So what it shows us is that the first 6 trumpets actually span that period of time from AD 31, when Jesus Christ began his heavenly ministry, until the close of human probation, when Jesus would have cast the censer down. And we said before that if you check ancient Israelite or Hebrew history, you realize that every time the evening sacrifice closed, the censer was cast down on the ground by the high priest. And you notice that the censer is filled with fire, indicative of the wrath of God, or the spirit of God, the character of God. The fire of God is twofold. It has to do with God sending his spirit upon his people, but it also has to do with God sending his wrath. So God is going to be sending his spirit to empower his people, but at the same time, he's also going to be visiting his wrath upon those who would have rebelled against him. So in this case, the fire falling upon the earth is indicative of judgment coming upon the earth. And you notice that voices, thunderings, lightnings, and an earthquake occurs. And when you check the record of the sixth trumpet, at the end of the sixth trumpet, that's exactly what happens. Voices, thunderings, lightnings, and an earthquake. And we'll look at that in more detail. But the point we need to